The Cold War officially ended with the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. Some Europeans would argue it was 1989, when revolutions across the Eastern Bloc signaled to many the downfall of communism. But whatever the case, you wouldn't notice that the Cold War ended just from watching geopolitical trends. NATO continues to expand. The United States angles itself against what it describes as an anti-democratic axis. Proxy wars crop up every few years all across the globe, and the fingerprints of American, now Chinese influence appear around the developing world. If one were to shut out coverage of the Soviet Union's collapse, you might think that the Cold War never ended, that in 1991 the United States merely gained an advantage and put Russia on the back foot, that what you see today is less a new age of global geopolicy, but simply a wrapping up of loose ends, and for many state officials, that is precisely how they see it. People have often asked me, Mr. Z, how do you manage to predict so many global circumstances with such accuracy? And a lot of it simply comes from fully understanding where the story began and paying attention to the little story beats along the way. There's long-term trends in play, some that are natural, some that are being engineered, some which are sustainable, others which are not. Looking at a map of the world today and the various developments unfolding across it, the damage done to the global psyche across the Cold War era continues to shape modern developments, though some are desperately attempting to escape from this paradigm. Tragically, as one part of the world tries to pull away, it almost seems like the rest of the world forcibly pulls it back in. Everyone just nervous enough that they fear rattling the status quo, even if they've all grown mutually tired of it in their own ways. Today we'll be going continent by continent or region by region to explore how every part of the world has been molded by Cold War politics and continues to roll along that beaten path laid out by this period, as well as what the future might have in store for them. This video began with the intention of being a half-hour long project, only for my script to balloon to about 100 plus pages, which I then abridged and simplified in some areas to prevent this from being several hours long. I still expect it to be well over an hour by the time I'm done, but this allows us to cover the most important developments in each region without losing any important details. This was quite an undertaking, so if you appreciate that, I would appreciate if you like the video, and if you enjoy what you see about a quarter or half of the way through, I'd encourage you to subscribe as well. Hello audience, Mr. Z here with another video for you. If you're new to the channel, welcome. We have videos on history and politics every week, so if you enjoy that sort of thing, be sure to subscribe and stay tuned. As you might imagine from the length of this video, it took a while to make and there were plenty of long nights staying up late, finishing the writing while cross-referencing just to make sure we got all the facts right. Imagine my luck when a little company reaches out to me saying they want to sponsor this video and send me a brand new mattress. The company is NOLA and they're famous for their cooling mattresses, pressure-relieving design, and durability. They delivered this box right to my door, and I think you can't blame me for thinking, what is this, a mattress for ants? But it was just compressed this way for easy transport. It was kind of a mattress burrito when I pulled it out. So naturally, once I started cutting the wrapper, this happened. I will say though, I'm not exaggerating when I say this mattress is extremely comfy. Just so you know I'm being serious here, I tried it out for a night before deciding whether I'd be using this or my old mattress, and this is just on a whole other level of comfort. I'm not gonna lie, I feel kinda ripped off by my old mattress company now. But don't let yourself get ripped off by uncomfortable mattresses. Get yourself some high quality sleep with NOLA, and remember you get a 120 night trial period just to make sure you really love your new mattress. Go to nolamattress.com/mr.z to get $50 off your order, plus any other discounts that might be going on site-wide. NOLA mattresses are proudly designed and assembled in the United States in the beautiful state of Arizona, where each mattress is made to order from coiling to foam pouring to sewing, promising quality and care for your mattress in every step. And absolutely zero use of harmful chemicals go into this, ensuring that your mattress is not just comfortable, but safe and wholesome. Fellas, I've been sleeping so good since I got this mattress, and I think you will too. For quality, for price, for the convenience of literally getting the mattress delivered in burrito form, in a box, right to your door. I think there's no other better choice out there but NOLA. The link will be in the description. Once again, that's nolamattress.com/mr.z for $50 off your order. Now, let's get right back to the video. Beginning in the US, the Cold War transformed the United States from a relatively isolationist and inwardly focused country into a true global presence. Now, these capabilities had been developing since the recovery of the country from the Civil War and the mass industrialization of America, seeing a boom in population and the development of a world-class navy rivaling even that of Britain's empire. Since those early days, the United States occasionally peeked its head beyond its waters to involve itself in foreign affairs. The acquisition of the Philippines, the Boxer Rebellion, the Russo-Japanese War, World War I, but it wasn't until the end of the Second World War that the United States finally began adopting a true global presence. With the great powers of both Europe and Asia shaken, only the United States and Soviet Russia emerged with the wherewithal to keep the global peace. The Soviets, being a superpower with boots in both the European and Asian continents, anticipated that this would be its time to spread its influence across the old world and shape a grand communist sphere. The United States, however, had developed its own vision for the globe and took to asserting itself beyond its borders in Europe and Asia to forge a free, democratic world of international cooperation. This was an idealism rooted in several other idealisms. The idea that, unlike the European powers, America had no ambitions of empire or extravagance. Many believed we had a moral purity to us which made us uniquely suited to fairly shape global politics and not merely take for our own interest. This idealism was given a public face with FDR's famous For Freedom speech, calling for freedom of speech everywhere in the world, freedom of religion everywhere in the world, freedom from fear everywhere in the world, and freedom from want everywhere in the world. And this was punctuated with the later proclamation of the Truman Doctrine, pledging American support to democratic nations against all authoritarian threats. The real root of this dates back to the days of Theodore Roosevelt, who believed that America, reaching the developmental heights it had, now had a responsibility to move beyond Monroe Doctrine and assume a role among the great powers as equals in an international global world order. That, quote, "We cannot, if we would, play the part of China and be content to rot by inches in ignoble ease within our borders. For as the nations grow to have ever wider and wider interests and are brought into closer and closer contact, if we are to hold our own in the struggle for naval and commercial supremacy, we must build up our power without our own borders." For Roosevelt, this meant not merely territorial acquisitions, but the protection of overseas interests and the building of an alliance network with the Democratic and Republican governments of Europe. Often this mindset is attributed to later President Woodrow Wilson, but these ideas did not manifest in a vacuum. They were a progression of America's sense of authority and a growing belief among many at the time that America was no longer an isolated regional power, but a global power the likes of Britain, France, and Germany. And the elder Roosevelt would reinforce this mindset for his younger relative, the future President FDR. This, hand in hand with the narrative that America's great investment in World War II was a crusade against tyranny, shaped an expectation for many Americans of what was to occur once the war was done. At the same time, there was a more realistic concern on the part of those who feared what may happen if the Soviet Union were allowed to expand unhindered. Did we defeat Hitler and Tojo just so Stalin could move in and take everything they had? And if the Soviets succeeded, how long before they turned their eyes toward us? So America acted quickly, backing anti-communist efforts in Greece and defending Turkey from Soviet pressure, enacting the Marshall Plan, partitioning Korea, establishing international organizations to promote democracy and economic liberalism. The United States was preparing a system of containment to keep the Soviets from growing too powerful, but still the US was idealistic. While the conceding of Greece or Turkey to communist influence was seen as an immediate threat which could create a domino effect across Europe, the United States gave less urgency to China, where there was a hope that the nationalists and communists would form a cooperative government. In truth, the United States merely restrained the nationalists from fully defeating the communists, who utilized this time to rearm, grow, and eventually expel the nationalists from the mainland. The United States had effectively handed China to communism, and this mistake would spell further troubles for the US in later years, gradually convincing America that it couldn't merely be reactive, but had to be preemptive, even in spheres it might not consider vital. China's turn to communism further intensified America's presence in the Far East, extending its occupation of Japan to make of the nationalist outpost of Taiwan an effective protectorate, and much the same occurred in Korea, where a failure of the US and USSR to agree upon a joint Korean government left the country split, eventually sparking a war in the Korean peninsula, in which the support of communist China allowed for the survival of communist North Korea. The United States was finally engaging in Cold War military interventionism, and the realities of global power politics hardened America's views and forced a retreat from certain idealistic beliefs. Restrictions placed upon Japan and Germany were partially lifted, their economies were rebuilt, and they were even encouraged to remilitarize despite a US-imposed constitutional clause in Japan which explicitly forbade remilitarization. In South Korea and Taiwan, democracy took a backseat to strong anti-communist leadership. The anti-authoritarian Truman Doctrine was quickly evolving into a plainly anti-communist doctrine, but that would revert back decades later. The new global responsibilities of the United States demanded a more robust intelligence apparatus to gather intel on foreign countries for the sake of preventing communist uprisings, and so the Central Intelligence Agency emerged and quickly grew in significance, eventually adopting a role in promoting regime change, often to the behalf of authoritarian but anti-communist leaders. This era was the true birth of America's covert intelligence sector, which did off the record what the United States couldn't do publicly. The potential reach and influence of this body has left many to question just how deep its power reaches, with some gradually coming to fear that the American intelligence apparatus now functions as something of a modern Praetorian Guard, influencing domestic elections, politics, and culture to shape political outcomes just as it does overseas. It might even be said that the anti-democratic nature of this body, how much it does behind closed doors, and the sheer resources at its disposal leave it teetering on the level of being a shadow government. American influence in Europe, in contrast to Asia, took on a more economic character. The implementation of the Marshall Plan, though in part an aid package, effectively imposed upon Europe a free trade and free market pact, which allowed American goods to more freely flow into their borders, not to mention giving the US dollar greater weight and creating a European dependence upon the United States, which could then leverage for greater military entanglement via NATO. Though it would never admit it, the United States was effectively building an empire, and it would establish the machinery to maintain that empire through international organizations like, of course, NATO, but also the earlier formed United Nations, IMF, and World Bank, along with the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, later to become the World Trade Organization. While nominally these organizations saw all participants as equals, the US's role as superpower, economic and military, gave it a disproportionate weight it still carries today in these organizations, which effectively allow it to command international agendas and policies, shaping an order that fits its vision of a free, democratic, liberal society of cooperation. In the Middle East, where the United States held perhaps the smallest footprint prior to the Cold War, the US found itself forced to adopt a role previously held by Britain in protecting the lucrative and vital oil trade of the region. Initially, this was achieved by backing pro-Western Arab monarchies, but as politics in the region evolved and Arab nationalism took root, the Soviets neighboring the region began to gain ground with these more revolutionary movements. The US receded, though maintained partnerships with the monarchies of Persia, Jordan, and Saudi Arabia, the Saudis having been of pre-existing interest to the US because of oil investment, and there was also the recently established Jewish state of Israel. At the same time, the US was actively pressuring its now European dependencies to decolonize. This was an almost entirely ideological public relations matter, attempting to court the global South by showing that America and the West stood for freedom and self-determination, and of course, these liberated countries would surely be pro-Western. They weren't. While it is true that the weakened European empires could not hold on to their imperial realms with the same force they once did, the extent to which they couldn't hold on to these territories is often exaggerated. As much was evident during the Anglo-French expedition to seize the Suez Canal, only for the US to step in and force them to step down. Many point to France's lack of success in Vietnam, but forget the success France saw in North Africa, though granted at the cost of grave brutality. As the clock ticked forward, these trends continued. Eisenhower's lackadaisical approach to Cuba, like with China and Asia, would further disillusion the United States government with certain idealisms of democracy, as Eisenhower allowed Cuban strongman Batista to be overthrown in the hope that the succeeding government would prove democratic, only for it to be revealed that Castro was in fact a communist. Who could have guessed? As a result, the United States began to embrace more firmly the idea of anti-communist Latin American strongmen, something which they had flirted with in the past and tolerated, but which was absolutely surging during the Cold War. Cuba was a very painful mistake for the United States, and one which the country was determined not to see repeated elsewhere in its neighborhood. The Kennedy and Johnson administrations would watch America slide deeper into interventionism, with the country's escalating role in Vietnam, seeing military spending surge, while news coverage of the conflict began souring American perception of Cold War strategies, and questioning if in fact the US was still the moral crusader fighting for peace and freedom like it made itself out to be at the beginning of the Cold War. The great mistake for the US here, and one it would not learn from, was that even when propping up authoritarian regimes, there must be an understanding of the country and what the people desire. The United States could not establish a perpetual hold in Vietnam because the Vietnamese saw the pro-Western government as oppressive, foreign, and out of touch. While not every Vietnamese was on board with Ho Chi Minh's communism, the vast majority resonated with his nationalistic message, and the US couldn't comprehend that. Under Nixon, even in spite of détente and efforts to cut spending, the US found itself caught in a perpetual war economy, fueling the emergence of a true military-industrial complex via the Nixon Doctrine, as the US receded from direct interventionism, but now encouraged other countries to combat communism with the promise of American funding and military equipment, the procurement of which enriched arms manufacturers and created an incentive for the perpetuation of foreign proxy wars. Through Henry Kissinger, Nixon further took to embracing pro-American authoritarians abroad, highlighting the reality that the Cold War had become less a struggle for freedom and democracy, not even a war on communism, but more a struggle between the US and its sphere against Russia and its sphere. Simultaneously, Nixon's move to cut New Deal programs marked a significant shift away from balancing domestic and foreign policy, growing more laissez-faire on the home front, while foreign affairs took on a prime focus. This would be further exacerbated under Reagan, who raised military spending in an effort to project strength and outspend the Soviets. Foreign interventionism peaked under Reagan, while the federal government played a smaller role back home. Reagan-style interventionism shifted away from containment and détente to full-on rollback and aggressively moved to reverse communist gains across the world, undermine Soviet and Chinese influence, and introduce a new dimension to foreign power by utilizing less direct and forceful means, such as the creation of the National Endowment for Democracy to implement the CIA's regime change formula in a more palatable fashion, toppling anti-American regimes not because they're anti-American, but in the name of freedom and democracy, installing leaders not through military coups but through propaganda and grassroots mobilization, all done with enough plausible deniability that when a country blamed the United States, the US could dust off its hands and say, "Looks pretty homegrown to me." This built upon the efforts of US aid established under Kennedy, which aimed to provide developmental assistance to the Third World, while simultaneously shaping social norms in favor of American-style liberal democratic values. The NED was effectively angled toward political change, while USAID was focused on cultural change. A third noteworthy instrument of America's soft power was the United States Agency for Global Media, which emerged from the United States Information Agency, established under President Eisenhower for the purpose of broadcasting propaganda into communist countries. And in its present form, which may cease to exist by the time this video is done depending on ongoing executive orders, oversees Voice of America, Radio Free Europe, Radio Free Asia, and Middle East broadcasting networks. Hand in hand with Reagan's free trade and free market vision came deindustrialization, which effectively made the United States economically dependent upon its global network in the name of transforming America from a productive power to a financial power. This did make the United States richer on paper, but at the cost of significant self-sufficiency. It was a propaganda move as well, demonstrating the US's faith in the international network it had established, a trend that would only be intensified later under Clinton. The Cold War had become so persistent an issue for so long that the infrastructure meant to combat and challenge the Soviet Union became permanent. Even with the fall of the Soviet Union, the United States could not let go of the reins of power. After all, how could it? So much of global infrastructure now ran on America. And more than that, the United States was just so close to achieving the utopian vision it had convinced itself of. Global liberal democracy, free trade, international cooperation. There were just a few holdouts left resisting the American order, and no doubt they too would soon be brought into line. The Truman Doctrine's line against authoritarianism in general was revived. Yes, the US had worked with authoritarians during the Cold War, but those were desperate times. Now we can afford to have higher standards. Clinton would also see the US move beyond challenging dictatorships to acting as a global peacekeeper. Quote, "The true measure of our interests lies not in how small or distant these places are, or in whether we have trouble pronouncing their names. The question we must ask is, what are the consequences to our security of letting conflicts fester and spread?" Post-Cold War America was truly shaped by President Clinton and his third-way neoliberal philosophy. It dialed back Reagan-era military intervention in favor of a softer-handed diplomatic approach, but still the US couldn't help but raise its fist every now and then in a show of force, or to attempt to stomp out a growing conflict. All the while, the American influence network of NED, USAID, and the US Agency for Global Media, which Clinton rebranded as the Broadcasting Board of Governors, were all continuing their work in pushing Americanism across the globe via soft power. Alright, let's take a little break here. If you've been enjoying the content so far, I'd like to invite you to subscribe to the channel and drop us a like. We're aiming to hit 300,000 subscribers by the end of the summer, and that deadline is coming up real quick, so I'd really appreciate your support. As a result of Cold War-era policy, the United States for just over 3 decades found itself wrapped in a global web of its own making. The once regionalist power of North America, even in spite of desires by the more non-interventionist Trump administration, finds itself forced to participate in the foreign affairs of nearly every continent for the sake of preserving stability, order, not simply unraveling geopolitical projects that have been decades in the making. Even insofar as non-intervention is concerned, the US government finds itself less on a path of fully withdrawing its global presence, but merely pivoting away from an Atlantic to a Pacific focus, intent on preventing China from growing into too large a threat. In Europe, the US appears to be pulling itself away from NATO and the EU, seeking to remove itself from the possibility of hostility between Europe and Russia, now that the European countries are thoroughly recovered. However, the mass demilitarization of Europe, or rather dependency of Europe upon America's military strength, has left these countries relatively underprepared for this outcome, and thus the US cannot simply drop this region at risk of leaving it defenseless, but must gradually wean it off over a period of years. Similar might be said for the Middle East, where for decades the United States worked to crack down on Arab nationalism and fundamentalist Islam to the benefit of its allies in the region, yet cannot cleanly withdraw itself until the perceived lasting peace has been achieved in the region, at which point the US will likely attempt to wash its hands of the matter and move on permanently. The nature of warfare and political influence has evolved, but nevertheless the objectives remain the same. The use of soft power and cultural influence sees America project its values and worldview on foreign populations on a scale never before imaginable, and in a fashion so organic it's virtually impossible to point blame toward the United States and its cultural machinery, even if it directly serves America's interests. Because of this, developing strong regional cultural institutions is not just a hobby or way of showing off your culture, it's becoming a geopolitical strategy and really an imperative for any regional society interested in preserving its independence. If the world runs on American social media, American movies, American music, American humor, American celebrities, all projecting the values of the country from which they originate, that's a degree of cultural penetration that can only be combated by having your own strong cultural institutions. We're a little bit blind to this in America because it surrounds us, but consider if the Saudis dominated global social media, entertainment, and the like, or if China did. In fact, we saw how fearful the US government was when China developed just one extremely popular social media platform, and the concerns that were raised by how China might use TikTok as a tool of global influence and spying. Culture has thus become a major geopolitical battlefield and will likely only become all the more important as the years go on until every major sphere of the world has developed their own. I could see people 50 years from now talking about the concept of cultural colonialism or imperialism and how the US was the first to use it on such a large scale. Cold War-era focus on foreign policy at the expense of domestic policy has also left the average American feeling severely neglected and even abused by their government, encountering the face of the law only in instances of penalization but scarcely in times of need. Because of this, it's not uncommon to encounter Americans critical of their government, not merely a party, but the government as an entity itself. The failure of the United States government to adequately provide for its people as it prioritized international stability has thus left many Americans disillusioned and others radicalized in their calls for reform. Thus, the rise of something like the MAGA movement was an inevitability given growing American frustration with neoliberal politics, and its lack of a left-wing counterpart is something of an anomaly, as anti-globalism had been a powerful force on the left for some time before the MAGA movement even came into existence. While it's possible this fizzled out on the left in reaction to its adoption by the MAGA movement, it's still perfectly possible left-wing anti-globalists could re-emerge once the Democratic Party reconsolidates its divided factions. Given the path America has followed, it does make you wonder if the United States will ever revert to a primarily regionalist power focused on North America exclusively, or if the superpower politics of the Cold War have simply locked the US into being a perpetual intervener in the affairs of Europe, Asia, and beyond, be it in the name of ideology or self-interest. Might the United States successfully best China and turn its eyes back home for the foreseeable future, or might the US and China be locked in a centuries-long rivalry like Rome and Persia? Now, for Latin America, there is a misconception that the rise of anti-left autocrats was something wholly or mostly fed by American Cold War paranoia and intervention. While the United States had taken to more actively meddling in Latin American affairs around the turn of the century, especially in the context of stabilization or economic interest, and did in fact directly work to enact regime change in certain states for its own gain, the phenomenon of the Latin American dictator is less a Yankee import and more a lasting tradition carried over from the more authoritarian governing style of the Spanish and Portuguese compared to the democratic and egalitarian English and their colonies. Class animosities have also always been far more pronounced in Latin America than in the more egalitarian United States. You often find governing in these countries held in the hands of a wealthy landowning elite against a relatively impoverished majority. In many ways, it was reminiscent of the oligarchical structure that existed in the southern United States for much of the 19th century. This creates the perfect breeding ground for fear of communist or commoner uprising among the powerful elites of these countries, many of whom often held military ties or, at the very least, looked highly upon the military as enforcers of order. Thus, when unrest or crisis strikes, you have right-wing coups, military juntas, one-party states, dictatorships, or politically ambiguous strongmen take power. When the Cold War arrived, the United States did not so much introduce this concept into Latin America, but rather nurtured and empowered it. Now, much of Latin America, like the American South, depended upon agriculture and resource extraction for economic survival, shipping these exotic products and raw materials to countries like the US, which, in and of itself, is another habit inherited from their time under Spanish and Portuguese rule, having largely been harvested for wealth rather than invested in and developed. Now, the script for this video predates my previous video on the 27 civilizations of the world, which I recommend you guys check out. But this is a long script, and I decided to go back and address what I saw many arguing in the comments of that video, that Spain had invested heavily in its colonies and wasn't merely extractive. But I've got to tell those guys that that's just outright wrong. There was some investment from the crown in the colonies, but by and large, this was for ports, forts, and roads dedicated to making the extraction process all the more easy. Spanish investment was effectively the bare minimum to facilitate and maintain their extractive strategy. Investments were made by the Catholic Church to, of course, establish schools, cathedrals, and some vital infrastructure, but by and large, these investments were made by the Church itself, not by the Spanish crown. Probably about 50% of investment in Latin America came from domestic colonial revenues, not from the crown. And the Church was the next largest investor at some 20%, with an almost equal amount coming from wealthy private citizens. You could argue the goodwill of the Church and the charity of private citizens financially built Latin America, but the crown, for the most part, did not, and it goes to show that there's only so much those institutions can do. Had the crown played a more direct role in building its colonies, they may have avoided the fate that would befall them. Like the South, the reliability of cash crops kept the elite satiated and stalled efforts at further development, which would have shaken the economic order and threatened the status of the wealthy landowners. Without strong domestic industries of their own, the economies of these countries and the stability of their governments were extremely vulnerable to changes in global supply and demand. If they couldn't import something, they didn't have it at all. And if they can't export their raw material, they have no other means of generating revenue to buy foreign goods. As you might imagine, the World War and Great Depression destabilized the Latin American economies, giving them the wake-up call they needed to begin building up domestic industries in the 1930s through protectionist measures. A new wave of Latin American strongmen cropped up to push for national modernization in their countries through government investment, the creation of state-run enterprises, and tariffing of foreign products. Much as was seen in the United States decades earlier, tensions arose between agriculturalists and urbanists. Landowners saw the rise of industry as a threat to their power, while reformers, growing in number as an increasing number of people across Latin America moved to cities, saw such individuals as holding back essential progress and modernization. The rise of this urban population would contribute to the emergence of labor movements in several countries, while the growth of an urban middle class contributed to the emergence of a new left-leaning elite, and much of this population would go on to form a technocratic bloc, less socially conservative than the rural elite, but more economically nationalist than them. And it's from here that many communists and anti-communists emerged. There are distinctions to be drawn between Latin America's rural communists and rural anti-communists, Latin America's urban communists and urban anti-communists. While on the surface they may appear to have similar goals, there were major divergences in what their ideal vision for the country entailed. World War II and the period immediately following would contribute to an intensifying of the modernization strategy as global markets were disrupted by the war, and the US pursued with Latin America a good neighbor policy of reciprocal investment and trade. The problem was complacency. Once a level of development had been achieved, these governments continued to coddle their industries without pressing them to further advance. Additionally, many of these state-run or subsidized enterprises began serving as mere patronage tools, doling out paychecks as favors to friends and political allies, effectively draining the government budget with nothing to show in return. Debts also began to rise because while industries were developed, most were still tailored to only meeting domestic needs and failed to be competitive in international trade. Thus, most Latin American countries continued to primarily be agriculture and resource exporters despite their emerging industry, and despite the fact that the agriculture sector had shrunk and was now being neglected. In the instances when agricultural reform was attempted to try to mitigate this, the United States grew convinced that this was a sign of land confiscation and communism, which led to regime change in 4 countries, though one of those 4 was actually very likely pro-Soviet. Probably. This approach only somewhat changed in 1961 when President Kennedy and the Alliance for Progress called for land reform to help neglected rural communities, but shortly then after this fell apart. The creation of the School of the Americas to train military officers, sharing of intelligence via the CIA, and heavy consumption of loans for domestic projects from the World Bank by various Latin American countries all contributed to a unique dynamic in Latin America where the United States was involved, active, but not as consciously invested as it was in Europe or Asia. Ironically, but it does make some sense. Latin America wasn't treated like a crucial partner the way Europe or Asia was. Those parts of the world required a more tactical approach, shaping up to a long-term vision for those regions. Latin America, however, as far as the US was concerned, just had to not become communist by any means necessary. It was a playing field, a game that just had to be won and be done with. There was no grand plan for Latin America, but it's close enough to the US that it can't afford to see it flip. And that half-hearted approach spells out what the Cold War would have in store for the region. As mentioned before, the fall of Cuba to communism would become a painful thorn in the US's side, seeing the Cubans act as a powerful outpost for the Soviet Union right off America's shores, from which the Cubans and Soviets worked to spread and support the rise of communism across Latin America, leading to the creation of various Marxist guerrilla movements, infiltration of several labor groups, and the courting of left-wing intellectuals. The Latin American communists most appealed to and preyed upon the lower classes who had not gotten to enjoy the fruits of industrialization, and if anything were harmed by it, as agriculture was strangled out by the demands of manufacturing, and the cost of living in urban areas, paired with the low opportunity, made upward mobility exceedingly difficult. Disenchanted rural populations, including indigenous groups, were organized into anti-government guerrilla fighters, while urban sympathizers orchestrated protests, espionage, and terror attacks. The United States wanted bulwarks against communism across Latin America, strong entities it didn't need to monitor or babysit. The problem was that even the regimes of authoritarians and the military had dramatically unstable track records across Latin America. Countries would fluctuate between chaos and authoritarianism so often that the United States simply began backing regimes that were seen as friendly and anti-communist, with the hope that there wouldn't be any need for major military intervention. In the case of Mexico and its Revolutionary Institutional Party, which had some initial left-leaning stances, the US was just content to have its southern neighbor under stable leadership after the chaos that swept Mexico from the 1910s to the 1920s. And naturally, attention was paid to ensure Mexico never drifted too close to socialism. A fascinating phenomenon during this time was the rise of what's called liberation theology among a subset of the Catholic population in these Latin American countries, especially in rural areas, beginning with a perception that Christians had an obligation to prioritize the welfare of the poor and vulnerable above others. It soon led some to begin amalgamating Catholic beliefs with socialist politics, and as a result brought government scrutiny to an institution which was previously held as a bastion of conservatism. This indirectly opened the door for evangelical Protestant missionaries from the US to gain a foothold in a handful of Latin American countries, as many took to aligning with American conservatism and opposing godless communism, earning the favor of the US and the anti-communist governments, and becoming prime recipients for American funding through US aid. By the 1970s, authoritarianism had become widespread and sustained across much of Latin America as the CIA took to collaborating closely with the Latin American regimes to crack down on leftist threats both domestically and abroad, allegedly aiding Argentina in its own propping up of anti-communist forces in Central America, proxies on top of proxies. But eventually, things came crashing down. The Latin American countries continued taking on loans and accruing debt to further their development, but as the oil crisis of the 1970s persisted, countries began raising interest rates, leading Latin American debt to skyrocket by over 1,000%. Suddenly, several countries became unable to pay back loans they had taken out, and with that development ground to a halt. Projects were frozen in place and never finished, and as a response, the International Monetary Fund would compel Latin American nations to dramatically reduce government spending and open their markets to free trade. Simultaneously, the Latin American regimes were tumbling every few years. Ecuador, Peru, Bolivia, Honduras, Argentina rather dramatically after the country's loss in the Falklands War, then Uruguay, Brazil, Paraguay, Chile, El Salvador, Guatemala, and finally Mexico in 2000 with the end of the Revolutionary Institutional Party's one-party rule. Deindustrialization, rising unemployment, and widespread poverty struck as a result of the enormous debt load and the IMF's imposition of neoliberalism upon the Latin American states. The desperation of this economic crash and the poverty it brought along with the lack of order created by the collapse of the regimes formed a pathway for many in need of money to enter into a life of crime, especially in the trafficking of drugs, weapons, and people. Arguably, Latin America's drug trade was also fed by its extractive economic model, as with few productive options, the harvesting and exporting of drugs was treated like just another resource to profit off of by selling to foreign buyers. There was a time when these sales were more on the level, but with the US regulating substances like cocaine and marijuana, the market moved underground and grew to a critical mass in the 70s. Rather than being erased by industrialization and development, new technology allowed the drug trade to be scaled and expanded. Unsurprisingly, probably the most industrially developed Latin American state, Mexico, is also the source of most synthetic drugs on both continents. Access to American markets was king, as the massive wealth drawn in could cement the role of a cartel and allow it to bypass law through financial power alone. Of course, force was another key element at play, and one which was bolstered by investment from the US and communist powers into weapon supplies across Latin America to combat or support communist insurgents. The experience gained during service paired with hard economic circumstances led many former military men to become operatives within the criminal world, transforming smuggler groups into full-fledged militarized cartels. Naturally, many in these countries blamed the globalist system, and the United States in particular, for the situation which had befallen them. The loosening of American and regime restrictions on left-wing parties, as well as a perception that American meddling with the regimes was what created the dire circumstances these countries now found themselves in, led to a left-wing backlash with a framing of anti-imperialism, which may better be understood as anti-foreign influence and anti-elitism. The newly emerged Latin American democracies were fragile, rife with corruption, and in many instances purely ineffective. Efforts were made by the United States to improve its reputation in the region, continuing its covert influence in Latin America through the National Endowment for Democracy and USAID-backed NGOs, as well as through its cultural presence. Not merely broadcasting pro-American media, but training journalists within these countries to report news stories from a pro-American, pro-liberal, and pro-capitalist perspective. Today, in spite of American influence, most Latin American countries have grown exhausted with neoliberalism, perceiving it as a tool for an influence to exploit Latin America, especially by the United States. Radicalism has re-emerged, and with it comes radical strongmen, in most instances, pursuing the same technocratic modernization and order-focused strategies of their forebears, and in other instances, seeking to forge a totally new path. Unfortunately for the Latin American countries, even after all this time, only Mexico has broken free of the trade curse and achieved a strong manufacturing and export economy. Yet it is still crippled by its crime, corruption, and lack of domestic innovation. Nearly the entirety of Latin America still largely subsists off of agriculture and resource exports. Some have managed to make the best of their situation, such as Brazil, Argentina, Chile, and El Salvador, but still the region remains highly dependent upon outside innovation and production and remains remarkably vulnerable to global economic tides. Latin America's story is a tragic one shaped by exploitation and independent shortcomings. Its future largely lays in whether or not its governments are able to enforce order and tackle the crime which has plagued their lands. A figure like El Salvador's Nayib Bukele has had remarkable success in achieving this, and as a result has notably improved the quality of life in his country, but still economic circumstances are stagnant even despite efforts to modernize the economy. His revival of Latin American technocracy is at risk of repeating the complacency which doomed similar leaders in the past, but Bukele is moving in the direction of mitigating this, having partnered with China early on to bring more investment into the country. Likewise, a figure like Argentina's Javier Milei is tackling another factor which plagues Latin American countries, and that is corruption and waste, albeit he is doing so with all the surgical precision of a weed whacker. Milei's purging of major government departments and agencies will remove a bloat of excess spending, but simultaneously this only perpetuates the country's economic dependence, doubling down on resource and agriculture exports while manufacturing withers, hoping this mass deregulation effort attracts foreign capital. At the same time, Mexico's Morena party, having held the past two presidencies, is also shaping up to be a strongman faction the likes of the Institutional Revolutionary Party, albeit with a more left-wing character, focusing on economic nationalism, progressivism, and opposition to corruption. In these three examples, we find what an ideal future for Latin America holds. Aims of restored economic nationalism in the vein of Mexico, aggressive law and order policing achieved through deepened executive power under strongman leadership in the vein of El Salvador, and a crackdown on government waste and corruption in the vein of Milei for more economically right-leaning governments, or in the vein of Bukele for more economically left-leaning governments. Mexico itself has arguably implemented a middle ground policy under its previous president by slashing salaries for high-ranking officials and firing 70% of federal workers seen as redundant or unproductive. See, people criticize Trump for doging employees, but Mexico was doing it before it was even cool. How realistic this ideal is, however, that's up for debate. For as much success as Mexico has seen, solving the problem of the cartels is difficult. Even in the case of Bukele's El Salvador, evidence is seeming to suggest that rather than just eradicate the gangs, the government may have initially negotiated an arrangement with them and then betrayed them later down the line, though Bukele denies that this was ever the case. The desperation of Mexico's government to seek compromise with the cartels could hint at the fact that Latin America has not truly found a way to stop the cartels, but to simply manage them. And in Mexico's case especially, the rug pull strategy that Bukele allegedly may have used isn't replicable because of Mexico's scale, the decentralized nature of its gangs, and the dysfunction of its central government, though that's not to say it's a possibility entirely off the table. Mexico would need to achieve a greater degree of centralized leadership across the country to achieve this, however, which has always been a hurdle for them and contributed to historic secessionist movements. It could be argued that Mexico's cartels are filling the role of regional warlords, and this vacuum has been left open because of the Mexican federal government's inability to project strength far beyond its capital. Latin America, despite its potential, is unlikely to produce a major world power in the near future, and at this point, its best hope is to establish partnerships with outside powers to enable it to reach the next step of development necessary to create a great power. Think Brazil with the BRICS countries, El Salvador and China, Argentina with Europe, even Mexico and the United States. This is a region that's still growing, and with that's going to come significant growing pains. Now, Europe, as we said, was rocked by World War II. Entire cities were razed to the ground, ports were destroyed, roads obliterated, agriculture was crippled, and industry was shattered. Millions of people were homeless, jobless, and foodless across the continent. As bad as things were, the Europeans could have recovered on their own, but granted, this would have been a much longer time frame of probably over a decade in some places. In that time, many more would have likely died of famine, and the risk of either Soviet invasion or communist uprising was very possible in France, Italy, Greece, and Germany. The French foreign minister, Italian prime minister, among others, even the left-wing British foreign secretary of the time, all sought American aid to provide them with a speedy escape from the post-war turmoil and ensure stability and freedom from the Soviet sphere. There were initial growing pains associated with the Marshall Plan as it demanded greater levels of international coordination, but altogether recovery was expedited as expected and fears of famine were alleviated. Hand in hand, the radical ambitions of local communist parties were suppressed, and the public felt less need for dramatic political change. This investment in Europe, the need for greater cooperation to facilitate continental recovery, and a sense of a common enemy in the form of the Soviet Union drove the European countries closer together. The United States and Britain felt a direct interest in mending pre-war rivalries and pushed France and Germany to collaboratively head up resource extraction and manufacturing, eventually leading to the creation of the European coal and steel community. At the time, this was seen as a geopolitical tool not just by the United States, but Britain as well, with the United States actively utilizing its intelligence apparatus to promote international integration across Europe. However, over time, what would evolve into the European Union took on a life of its own, ceasing to be an Anglo-American anti-Soviet bulwark and become the basis of a new geopolitical entity, one with a vision of its own. The Marshall Plan would end and American aid to Europe would diminish as the Korean War broke out at the turn of the decade. though not before the creation of NATO in 1949 and the guarantee that at least part of Europe would be protected by the United States and all members involved. By this point, the Europeans were getting back on their feet, production had returned to and surpassed pre-war levels, and the coal and steel community would formally be established in 1951 and see the powers of Western Europe drawn closer together economically. Plans were developed for a European defense community independent of NATO, which was never ratified by Italy and France, but which was never rejected either, meaning that some 70 years later this could still be signed off on by the two remaining countries. The goal of the coal and steel community was to create something of a codependence between these countries and make war between them impossible. The inevitability was that a new entity would emerge from this, not with French or German, but pan-European interests. With the return of Charles de Gaulle to power in France toward the end of the decade, Europe now had a domestic leader who sought a new path for the continent and for France, asserting greater autonomy for France itself out of recognition that the US and UK, though the US primarily, maintained significant influence over pan-European institutions, beginning to sense that in the long term, it was not merely the Soviets that Europe needed to concern itself with, but the threat of overreaching influence by the Anglos and Americans, whom Europe had so quickly welcomed into their institutions. De Gaulle envisioned a Europe independent of the West and East, a confederation of nations operating in cooperation and unity with each other, regaining their imperial grandeur and achieving hegemony over the world, including a retaking of European Russia from the Soviet scourge. To achieve this, France would develop its own nuclear arsenal, giving continental Europe a nuclear hand outside of Britain, America, and the USSR, while also withdrawing France from NATO's integrated command. While the United States retained a firm stance against the communist powers of Russia and China, de Gaulle moved Europe in the direction of normalizing relations with the communist Chinese, signaling the reality that 1. France and Europe maintained diverging interests from the United States, and 2. Reining in a hostile Russia not necessarily engaging in communist containment was the priority of Europe. As you might imagine, this was not appreciated by the United States. By the time he took office, Europe had officially transitioned away from the coal and steel community to forge the European Economic Community. Europe now began to move toward direct economic integration, and France explicitly rejected Britain's participation in this group on the belief that it would allow for an Anglo-American subversion of Europe's sovereignty, though this would change after de Gaulle stepped down from the presidency. The economic community would further efforts at ever closer union. While hesitations remained and de Gaulle had laid a standard for a Europe of nations, confederated but not assimilated into one another, his successors in Europe would move toward the concept of federation, full unity between the European peoples under a banner of liberty, egalitarianism, and brotherhood in a democratic European society. Europe had learned from the Great Wars a fear of conflict, a fear of authoritarianism, a fear of ruin. They had experienced that once and hoped to never need repeat it. The European ideology became one of non-confrontation, of appreciation for the advancement, civility, and luxury that their strong economies and high standards of living had afforded them. With the United States carrying on its shoulders the nuclear shield of NATO to protect them, the Europeans effectively adopted their own version of Japan's Yoshida Doctrine, focusing less on their military security and instead on their economic strength. Europe shifted from French to German leadership after de Gaulle stepping down, growing somewhat idealistic and believing that war was no longer something they needed to concern themselves with. After all, that was the very foundation of their union, to prevent war from ever plaguing the Europeans again. Despite the UK's eventual entry into the economic community, divisions persisted between the Anglos and Europeans, and such became clear during the 70s when, in response to the oil crisis, Britain veered hard to the economic right, while Europe gravitated ever so slightly leftward, seeing the generally dominant Christian democratic parties of Europe threatened by more left-wing movements. This decade nearly compromised the unity they had built over the prior years as goals diverged and the economic crunch fueled debate about member states, but in time tensions relaxed. The European countries gradually embraced neoliberalism, and the shortcomings of the 70s drove a great move toward alternative energy sources, smarter, more high-tech manufacturing, and greater economic resiliency. The fall of the Soviet Union would begin yet another dramatic shift in European policy. With the Soviets gone, the stigma toward left-wing economics lessened. The European community would fully mature into the European Union, adopt a single currency in the form of the euro, and further invite members of the former Eastern Bloc to join its ranks. The reunification of Germany would cement the country's role as the economic leader of the Union, becoming the continent's strongest economy, though France would eventually re-emerge, creating a dynamic in which Germany acted as Europe's economic engine and France as its political pilot. With the Cold War behind them, the Europeans demilitarized significantly, and former members of the Eastern Bloc and post-Soviet states were welcomed into the Euro-Atlantic Partnership Council, a forum for these countries in NATO to discuss and cooperate on security matters. In time, the countries of the former Eastern Bloc would join the European Union, but the transition has not been an easy one. While Western Europe's countries, with the exception of Britain, have taken well to union and even to the prospect of closer integration, the countries of Eastern Europe have been resistant to fully embracing the EU, even in spite of economic incentive. Membership in the European Union seems less an enthusiastic venture for these countries, and more an opportunity that has been seized upon, but which may be dropped if a better alternative veers its head. Keep in mind the basis for union between these two halves of Europe is also quite different. Yes, the West unified for economic incentive, but beyond that was a desire to never again fall into the chasm of a continental war, primarily between France and Germany, and gradually that evolved into a vision of European unity and economic hegemony against the threat of American influence or Russian aggression. And it's primarily in that latter camp where the Eastern Europeans find some common ground. The Eastern Europeans have not committed to the vision of Europe a superpower, but they have committed to never again falling under Russian dominion, and they have been more than eager to bring themselves under the economic shield of Europe and the military shield of NATO. While their military investment lagged behind upon joining the West, following Russia's 2014 annexation of Crimea, they became among the most eager to raise military spending as a percentage of their GDP. At the same time, the states of Eastern Europe simply operate differently than the rest of Europe, maintaining more centralized governments with little local autonomy as a legacy of communist leadership. Soviet influence also shielded many of these countries from socially liberal Western culture, and the tribulations experienced under communism have hardened Eastern sentiments into a colder, more conservative outlook, while the West grew comfortable and idealistic. The development of secularization in both spheres is interesting and complex. While developments in the standard of living in Western countries and the promotion of more liberal values gradually drove faith to the sidelines as people treated it less like a source of guidance, assistance, care, and community, and more like an inconvenience, in many Eastern Bloc countries, faith was aggressively stamped out by the Soviets but managed to endure in states with a strong resistance to Soviet rule, namely Poland. The church was a refuge, an assertion of identity, and an integral flame of Polish life which could not be snuffed out. Similar might be said of Romania as well, and perhaps some other debatable instances. In the cases of East Germany, Hungary, the Czech Republic, and Estonia, the story is very different. Whether because of far harder crackdowns like under Germany's Stasi, religious divisions like in Hungary, or frail religious institutions like in Estonia where the faith was never firmly tied to Estonian identity, secularism took root with a lot more effectiveness. Now, the former Eastern Bloc countries are content to work with the European West on their shared goal of containing Russia as a threat, and the economic incentives of the Union are powerful enough to keep these countries invested. However, as the West pushes toward increased federation and integration, and so long as the governing politics remain socially liberal, the East will resist and seek to retain its autonomy. This could be a breaking point and eventually see the Eastern Bloc form its own parallel union while still collaborating with the West on defense, or it could see the emergence of a more pronounced two-speed Europe, in which the West unifies into a proper federation while the East remains a part of the EU, but with a much higher degree of autonomy. Another alternative might be that a more European nationalist government comes to power in France, effectively courting the East into federation in a way that a more liberal government could not. Germany might also be a possibility for this, but given AfD's Eurosceptic views and less hostile stance toward Russia and the United States, this is far less likely to appeal to either the West or the East. It is, after all, German nationalist, not European nationalist. Insofar as defense, it's clear the security provided by NATO in some ways infantilized Europe. Outside of the Soviet Union and Britain, France was the only country investing heavily into its armed forces in a competitive fashion, clearly working in an effort to rival Britain and position itself as Western Europe's leader. And that competitiveness, which in the past would have been fueled by the risk of war and interstate rivalry, that's largely gone away with the sense that the United States will simply take care of any hostile threats they face. But now Europe is being met with new realities, especially as the United States seeks to disengage from Europe, and Russia has shown itself to still have an appetite for war. The Europeans, for the first time in a long time, must stand militarily ready on their own, and this is something that has been building for a while. as France has long advocated for the establishment of a joint European military, though, ironically, has still failed to ratify the 70-year-old European Defense Community Treaty. And having borne witness to the war between Russia and Ukraine, the whole of Europe senses a greater need for such cooperation than ever before. NATO as an alliance is coming into question as an outdated arrangement, and the Europeans may need to begin seeking an alternative of their own, focused upon their own priorities. Russia is not the only threat the Europeans fear, though it is the most pressing. The shadow of American influence still lingers over them, as everything from American economics to politics to culture bleeds into Europe, and many increasingly feel as though Europe is losing its identity to America, furthering calls for European sovereignty, independence, and self-sufficiency, not merely in geopolitical matters, but in fields of entertainment, tech, social media, to preserve Europe's culture and keep out American political influences. But this isn't the only angle from which Europeans feel their culture is under attack, as since the 2015 migrant crisis and subsequent waves of immigration moving into the continent, conservative Europeans have feared that this demographic change, much of which is coming from the Islamic world, will have irreversible impacts upon the identity of the European continent, and though response to this concern was slow at first, several European countries have begun strengthening border security, establishing faster deportation policies, deporting foreign criminals, establishing deals with other countries to halt or receive migrants instead of allowing them to arrive and remain in Europe, promotion of assimilation, breaking up of ghettos with over 50% non-Western residents, and restricting migrant access to various social services. Still, many argue these policies are too limited in scale, and the EU's policy at large does not reflect this trend being seen in the individual countries. Ideologically, Europe is waking up to realities it needed not face under the protective arm of the United States. Faced with the prospect of an overbearing US to the west and a potentially expansionist Russia to the east, the Europeans will need to grapple with matters of self-sufficiency and how to achieve it, particularly in the field of resources. Technologically advanced as Europe is, they fall behind the United States and China in major fields and may begin to lean upon the Chinese as a more neutral ally if they cannot break out social media, automation, and AI advancements of their own. Fueling this development, as well as the creation of a European army and a self-contained system, will require resources, and the main places to look, which may not be fully dominated by the US and Russia, are South Asia, South America, and Africa. Given the economic and developmental states of the latter two, this path could very well lead the Europeans into a new age of colonialism, which would simply be a return to course, as even during the time of the European Economic Community, France envisioned Africa playing a key role for Europe as a hub of resources. It's unlikely this will manifest in the form of full-on settler colonialism as in the past, but integration and partnership with certain states who can act as dependencies while benefiting from the economic development Europe has to offer. Something of a more benign model of China's debt trap system, resource for infrastructure deals, but of course this would take even closer coordination on foreign policy between the European countries. But then again, the threat of Russia is accelerating the realization that this is something that they want to aim for. Almost certainly, once the conflict in Ukraine wraps up, there will be a push among the Europeans for deeper integration and the establishment of a defensive pact outside of NATO. Europe's society is democratic but orderly. There is a strong belief in an unspoken social contract between the citizenry and the government. This means Europe and the Europeans are more ready and willing to adopt things like surveillance drones, facial recognition cameras, and media censorship for the sake of promoting a safer society, though of course toward different ends. Poland, for instance, has aimed to intensify its blasphemy laws, criminalizing the offending of religious feelings, while France has both authorized courts to censor any information they deem to be fake news, and simultaneously criminalized forms of religious extremism, primarily Islamic extremism, and putting mosques under close state control for the sake of promoting security and secular democracy. Clearly, the Europeans are not above utilizing more authoritarian methods, but it's a type of light authoritarianism in which democracy and liberty are still the norm, but the state will immediately step in if the order is disrupted, whether it be a more conservative order like in Poland or a more liberal order like in France. This too is a return to form for much of Europe, as it has historically held itself to values of both liberty and order, the kind of policy style that you might expect of an enlightened despot or a constitutional monarch. The Russians over the course of 129 years faced not one, not two, but three major invasions into their heartland by Napoleon, the Kaiser, and Hitler. The first of which drove the Russians to retreat eastward, the second of which led to the fall of the Tsardom, and the third of which nearly ended the existence of Russia entirely. With World War II freshly over and recognizing that as an authoritarian communist power, Soviet Russia was the black sheep of the Allied powers, Stalin immediately adopted a defensive stance, not trusting his former allies to uphold their commitments, fearing that they would stab Russia in the back, which, ironically, repeatedly led Russia to fall back on its own commitments. But can you really blame them, after a recent history of being repeatedly invaded by the West and, of course, being almost immediately betrayed by Germany after signing their non-aggression pact? While the West perceived Russian expansion across Eastern Europe as a sign of aggression and communist ambition, from the Russian perspective this was a defensive measure, an effort to erect a barrier between Russia and what the Russians saw as an expanding Anglo-American empire across Europe and Asia, encircling and threatening them. Of course, the Russians held ambitions of spreading their communist ideology as well, but that was an ideal for them, a secondary goal. The primary goal, the need they felt, was security, and both goals were achieved through the creation of the Eastern Bloc, states whose primary purpose was to stand as subservient guards for Russia against Western encroachment. So much was the case that the Eastern Bloc served Russia that the Russians effectively reverse Marshall planned these Eastern European countries, seizing from them resources and assets around 15 billion in value to strengthen and replenish their own industry. Subservience was key, not merely communist alignment, and that's part of the reason relations between Russia and Yugoslavia and later China would break down. The Russians felt themselves the undisputed leaders of the communist sphere, and any resistance to this view was seen as a threat to Russian legitimacy, and thus their geopolitical standing and security. Beyond a mere buffer, Russia aimed to eradicate what they believed was the chief potential threat on the continent, the country which had invaded them twice within 30 years, Germany, who had proven themselves to have surpassed France as the great continental power of the West. For Russia to rest securely, Germany would have to perish. Thus, a keeping of the country partitioned and pushing for its deindustrialization became part of Russia's agenda until the turn of the decade, at which point East Germany began to function as a workshop for the Soviet Union. The second great peril the Soviets perceived was the American atomic bomb. Despite popular belief, the Soviets had been engaged in the exploration of nuclear power and its military application for nearly as long as Britain, Germany, and the United States had, but Soviet methods were far more scattered as the government placed greater emphasis on conventional warfare up until the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. At which point the Soviet government assumed a far more direct role in developing a nuclear weapon. Through a combination of espionage, government pressure, and the assistance of captured German scientists, the Soviets achieved nuclear detonation in 1949, at least 4 years ahead of when many anticipated that they would catch up. This was Russia's deterrence, its first and strongest line of defense against a direct European or American incursion into its land. The games of the Cold War reflected their different priorities, namely security and ideological domination. The arms race was a matter of security, ensuring the other side could not strike you, but the space race was ideological, a way of saying, look how superior our way of life is, that we can put this ship or this person this far into space. And the proxy wars were where you found a combination of both strategic and ideological value. The nuclear arsenal was built up, and Soviet Russia cracked down on dissent within the Eastern Bloc, shoring up control over their sphere of influence. Once this was achieved, Russia shifted to its secondary objective, ideological warfare. Both the United States and Russia had utopian visions of the world they sought to make reality, and once spheres were established and secured, the playing field was set up, and the game could finally begin. It's important to understand that much as the United States held a sense of exceptionalism, so too did the Soviets. Before the rise of communism, the Russian Empire held itself as the Third Rome, the great power of the Christian Orthodox world. The rise of communism took that sense of importance and duty and hijacked it. The Soviets, embracing Marxist philosophy, saw the course of history moving in the direction of communism. It was just inevitable to them. But they, as the first successful communist polity, had a responsibility to sustain and spread the revolution across the globe. And remember, the Russians didn't see themselves as villains here. They believed communism to be an ultimate good for humanity, and that the American vision was in fact the dystopia. The Russians saw in the West a passing of imperial infrastructure from Britain to the United States, and the liberal democratic capitalist order that the United States aimed to pursue was either overly idealistic or intentionally flawed, creating weak and decadent governments whose true rulers would be the moneyed international elite. The Soviets would argue, at least under the governments of radical nationalists, there was a sense of communalism and care for the common good within a national unit, but what the United States aimed to achieve was essentially to undo centuries of progress away from man's selfishness. From the Soviet perspective, it was the United States who was the evil empire with this radical ideology that they sought to force on the globe. Russia was able to justify its more ruthless and authoritarian structure because 1. Authoritarianism had always been a consistent feature of Russian rule, and 2. The Soviet Union framed itself as an island of communism surrounded by a raging sea of reactionaries, imperialists, and anti-revolutionaries who aimed to submerge them at first opportunity. The Russians didn't even particularly see themselves as the instigators of the Cold War, rather blaming the military overreach of the United States via the Truman Doctrine and NATO, so-called economic imperialism in the form of the Marshall Plan, the threat of nuclear annihilation, of course, and the well-known plot among some British and American circles to invade Russia after defeating Germany in World War II. Again, from the Soviet perspective, they don't see themselves as the bad guys here. In many ways, the Soviets were just like the Americans, idealistic and moving into the post-war era with a sense of moral exceptionalism which gradually eroded as the public began to question the path their countries had taken, whether behind-the-scenes scandals in America brought to public light, or overt hypocrisy carried out by the Soviet-Russian politicians. For all the talk Americans have of the American dream being out of reach today, much the same occurred in Russia during the Brezhnev era as students raised with the narrative of altruistic heroes, Soviet values, and noble class struggle grew up to find a system which was far from the utopia that they were promised. But while Marxism lost its hold, nationalism filled the void. For the achievements of Soviet Russia did still exist. They industrialized rapidly, emerged victorious in the Second Great War, achieved nuclear dominance, and built a grand empire. This was not a Marxist achievement, but a Russian achievement, as they saw it, and the Russians felt proud. The mindset became that there was nothing wrong with Russia, it was Marxism that had come to fail them. But let's not get ahead of ourselves, we still have to talk about what happened immediately after Stalin. The heavy hand of Stalinism came to an end under Khrushchev, who attacked Stalin's legacy openly and called for de-Stalinization, which directly contributed to a liberalization and a rise in anti-Soviet sentiment in the countries of the Eastern Bloc. While many recall Gorbachev for his liberalization of the Soviet Union, the beginnings of the process came under Khrushchev, massively scaling back the totalitarianism of Stalin's regime, opening the country up to more Western influences, and raising the Soviet standard of living in the belief that the Soviets must triumph over the West through a show of superiority of lifestyle. This was idealistic, however, as doubt began to be sown within Russia as the portrayal of Westerners in propaganda eroded and left Soviet citizens doubtful. This exposed an idealism of Khrushchev's, his belief that the Soviet Union could win over the world and draw them into communism through sheer example alone. But what he failed to realize, and what Stalin understood, was that the USSR was nowhere near ready to stand as an open example. It had shortcomings which still needed to be overcome, and these were best addressed covertly, extremely, and while maintaining a stance of strength against the West. Khrushchev effectively unbuttoned Russia's shirt, exposed its flabby belly, and expected the world to be impressed. They weren't. Conventional militarization was cut back and tech and economic innovation began, including nuclear and missile defenses. Khrushchev achieved the withdrawal of American missiles from Turkey as a result of the Cuban Missile Crisis, but the resolution was largely seen as an embarrassment on the part of the USSR because the American withdrawal remained undisclosed for a time, making this a strategic win, but an ideological PR disaster. Even as he was ousted, Khrushchev took pride in the fact that he had ended the stranglehold of Stalinism, even taking his ousting as a sign that the times had changed, and Russia was no longer the totalitarian centralized state run on fear that it had been only a few years earlier. Khrushchev's successor Brezhnev attempted to roll back Khrushchev's liberalization and decentralization, but the damage had been done, and worse yet, Russia was finally beginning to run out of steam. Enthusiasm for maintaining the Eastern Bloc was waning, and both Hungary and Poland asserted more autonomy, as did Czechoslovakia before being aggressively suppressed. China, once believed to be a powerful prospective ally, had become disillusioned with the Soviet Union's liberalization and de-Stalinization, and began charting its own course, which led the Soviets under Brezhnev to realize that there was no longer a leader or a unified communist world. Once again, it was merely Russia and her allies against everyone else. The Soviet economy too began lagging, as while the country continued to develop industrially for the sake of military production, it failed to adapt to the emerging digital computer tech field, which was opening the door to massive economic growth for the West. And of course, while Brezhnev attempted to rein in the additional freedoms Khrushchev provided, there was no way to unbake the cake. Soviet citizens had a taste of freedom for the first time ever, and they were hesitant to see it taken away so quickly. Soviet stagnation would persist until its eventual collapse. Stalin had, through extreme means, taken Russia and turned it into a chugging engine. How sustainable it was, that's unclear, but the mistake his successors made was stopping that train dead in its tracks. Because, as we would see, every successor after would attempt to get that engine moving again, but simply couldn't get it done. Russia increasingly wanted the Cold War to be over and done with. Little was being gained. The zeal of the Stalin era was gone. The global communism plan had fallen short and fragmented. Russia just wanted to go back to focusing on its own development, to end the growing bureaucracy within its borders, to end the overextension abroad. Something just had to give, and it would. Following Brezhnev's two brief successors, Mikhail Gorbachev would take power. Under him, the process of liberalizing the Soviet Union, which had begun under Khrushchev, would be brought to completion by the 12th and final 5-year plan, a part of the larger perestroika agenda, hand in hand with a final opening up of the country to the West. At the time, many would have argued the fall of the Eastern Bloc in the Soviet Union was a shock, a surprise, but recognizing the trends occurring within Russia's sphere, it was an inevitability. The Soviet Union was dead the moment Khrushchev denounced Stalin and cracked the mythos the USSR was built upon. It just took time for reality to catch up with it all. The Eastern Bloc began to fragment, rebel, and break away, and not long after the same happened to the Soviet Union, collapsing and leaving only Russia behind, chaotic and spiraling. There was some hope among Russians that under the democratic leadership of liberal Boris Yeltsin, there would be a chance of putting the Cold War in the past, integrating with the West, and sharing the prosperity they had by that point contrasted with their own life in Russia. But this was far from reality. Russia's economy would be shocked by the economic and political shift away from Soviet governance. Former national industries would be rapidly bought up cheaply by opportunists who thus become oligarchs, or by foreign entities which saw an opportunity in exploiting the vulnerable country's resource wealth. Average life expectancy dropped, corruption ran rampant, quality of life crashed, crime rose dramatically, and poverty and wealth inequality reached levels rivaling those of the Great Depression in the United States. Russia was experiencing an even worse shock to their economy than the countries of Latin America did following the crisis of the 70s. Yeltsin came to be viewed as a pawn of the West by most Russians. Resistance to perceived predatory Western economics and policy began to grow, especially as Russia faced difficulty gaining access to Western institutions, namely NATO, which Russia feared would continue to be angled against them, especially as the alliance crept closer to their border. And as the West protested Russian assertion in geopolitical matters they felt stood within their own sphere, the backing of Serbia, the suppression of the Chechen rebellion within their border, skepticism among the Russians grew even stronger. With the ascension of Vladimir Putin, Russia shifted its agenda back to an internal focus geared towards self-strengthening and achievement of economic independence. Yet, Russia continued to pursue partnership with the West, struggling to balance its ambitions of maintaining a Russian sphere while joining with a world order overtly dominated by the United States. Likewise, a Cold War prejudice continued to color American perception of Russia, especially within neoliberal political circles, and underhanded methods were undertaken to try to isolate and weaken Russia further, namely through the creation of color revolutions via NGOs established or funded by the National Endowment for Democracy. The 2014 revolution in Ukraine was the straw that broke the camel's back and provoked Russian intervention in the country, leading to the annexation of Crimea and the backing of separatists in the Donbass, which would later lead to the full-scale Russia-Ukrainian war, when Ukrainian President Zelensky put forward a platform explicitly aligning Ukraine with the West and stating an intention to retake Crimea and the Donbass, stoking Russia to launch its invasion. Ultimately, Russia's story is one of survival and paranoia, though a paranoia that's not necessarily without merit. Stalin and most of Russia's fear of Western invasion is justly placed, and it was that fear that drove the country to transform from a barely industrial agricultural backwater into a nuclear powerhouse. Russia's western lands are particularly vulnerable given their location on the Eurasian plain, and the maintenance of a buffer zone has always been of crucial concern for them, one that's all the more important today as Russia's buffer has shrunken significantly since its Soviet and imperial days. The mistake for the Russians was idealistically assuming that Eastern Europe would willingly remain attached to them given viable alternatives. Russia needed more time to develop itself, and prematurely began peeling away the harsh measures which kept the Union running. Stripped down significantly, Russia would rather return to that strong centralized authority and focus on self-sufficiency than to make itself vulnerable again. The memory of Russian vulnerability in the aftermath of the USSR's collapse is still fresh in the mind of many Russians, and it is a place few, if any, wish to return to. Russia's hopes of reconciling with the West grow slimmer by the day, but the possibility of partnership with the United States, even in spite of heated rhetoric over the war in Ukraine, does still exist. But foremost for Russia is simply its own security and its own interest. Everything else is secondary. Because in the eyes of the Russians, they have no permanent allies. Europe is a threat, America is a threat, China is a threat, and Russian attention will be directed toward protecting itself and its people. That being said, of the threats it faces, the United States is the most unnecessary enemy. The Europeans have an ingrained fear of Russia, and that will lead to military buildup and animosity. The Chinese are ambitious, powerful, and right along Russia's most underpopulated border, all whilst they develop alliances and dependencies across Asia. The United States only finds itself in hostility with Russia because of its ties to Europe, which it is gradually working to shed to focus on China instead, which is a shared rival of Russia's. Given all the circumstances in play, the Russians are likely aware that the US can cease to be an adversary and instead become a valuable partner in checking China. Of all the countries in the world, perhaps none were pulled more closely into the American orbit than the countries of the Anglosphere. Britain had, at least since the Great War, if not earlier, come to believe that it and the United States shared a special relationship, that through shared history and heritage, despite their divergent paths, the two were inextricably linked. For many in British leadership, this amounted to the belief that America had grown into Britain's most successful son, and thus, whether they knew it or not, had an obligation to aid their motherland, and with the Second Great War having exhausted Britain so severely, succeed them as the hegemon of the West, maintaining and furthering civil liberties, common law, free enterprise, personal freedom, and democratic governance. Before the end of the Second Great War, Britain and the United States laid out post-war plans in the Atlantic Charter, establishing a commitment to freedom of the seas and of trade, international cooperation, and abstaining from territorial acquisition post-war, and perhaps most alarmingly for Britain at the time, self-determination of peoples, which Churchill had hoped referred specifically to the peoples of Europe, then roped into large land empires, but the clause would ultimately serve as a basis for total decolonization, which placed Britain's empire squarely in the crosshairs, and which would effectively remove them as a leading global power, leaving the role to be picked up by the United States. Though in theory this was meant to usher in a period of global cooperation among equals. However, this would take either a great degree of naivete, which the United States, being as relatively isolated as it was, could be guilty of, or it was a stroke of manipulative political genius, removing and replacing Britain as the head of the Western world order. Canada, Australia, and New Zealand all naturally fell into the American line. Canada, with Britain's submission to American authority and Canada's proximity to the United States, saw its relations with the US grow ever closer. Australia and New Zealand, though initially clinging to their preference for the motherland, ultimately fell under American sway as well, given the tremendous hold the superpower held over the Pacific sphere, and newly emerging concerns once communism took hold in China and began spreading into Korea and Indochina. The real breaking point for Canada was the Suez Crisis, when it became clear that the United States had assumed the leading role in the relationship with the UK by compelling it to surrender control of the Suez Canal. For the South Pacific Anglo powers, it was Britain's effort to integrate into the European economic community that ultimately broke them, feeling as though the motherland was shifting focus from its dominions to Europe. For years, it appeared as though the project for a united Europe was merely a continental venture, and Britain would continue to maintain its autonomy and focus itself upon its colonies, not subjecting itself to Europe, but guiding it, making it a new sphere of influence, just as it had guided the United States and the Commonwealth. But that narrative was falling apart. Britain was in greater decline than any of the other Anglosphere countries, as it had been the most directly impacted by the war. Australia, Canada, and New Zealand, in contrast, were experiencing a post-war boom, seeing their industries invigorated while being far removed enough to have not been badly scarred by the conflict. A massive flow of immigrants from Britain and the rest of Europe poured into the Anglo countries, bolstering their populations, while Britain, upon passing the Nationality Act of 1948, began receiving an inflow of migrants from the Caribbean, Africa, and South Asia, as the act had extended British citizenship to all citizens of the empire. This, like France's establishment of the French Union or the concept of a pluricontinental Portugal, was most likely an effort by Britain to avoid decolonization by arguing that its overseas lands weren't lesser colonial possessions, but equal and integral parts of the country. Fascinatingly, around the 1960s and 70s, the United States, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand had major pivots in their immigration system, opening their countries up to large numbers of non-European immigrants for the first time, while Britain, inversely, and in response to the backlash from the waves of migrants from the colonies, actually tightened its immigration regulations for several years. This shift is especially pertinent for Canada, as it was around this time that the Canadians adopted multiculturalism as a core part of their identity under the leadership of Pierre Trudeau, which he did in part to try to undercut rising Quebec ethnic nationalism, which in part was inflamed by a trip French President Charles de Gaulle took to Quebec, during which time he shouted "Long live free Quebec," at a time when the French-speaking region of Canada was seeking independence by riding the wave of decolonization. It seems Pierre Trudeau would have preferred Canada become a menagerie of countless identities than allow Quebec to break away. It's actually kind of sinister, but also a strategic Cold War play, since Quebec was beginning to show strong socialist tendencies, but at the same time Trudeau effectively obliterated Quebec's claim to being one of Canada's founding people and forcibly put them on equal footing with every new immigrant group in the country in an effort to crush their claim to legitimacy and their national pride. The sense that mainland Britain was falling into decline further contributed to the gravitation of the Anglo colonies to the United States, seeing the rising influence of American culture, economics, and politics, while behind-the-scenes military coordination, intelligence sharing, and strategic interoperability was developed, arguably to an even greater degree than with the NATO countries, of which Britain, Canada, and the United States were already members. The Anglosphere countries effectively became America's direct hands in the European, Pacific, and Arctic realms, allowing for a deeper level of penetration and cooperation than might have been feasible with the Europeans or the Japanese. Politically, all the Anglosphere countries shared in Britain's post-war consensus, though achieved it at differing rates, largely embracing nationalization or protection of industries, the establishment of a universal healthcare system, progressive taxation, support for unions, creation of a welfare state, enacting of business regulations, and adoption of Keynesian economics. This consensus would remain in place until around the 1980s, when the rise of neoliberalism or neoconservatism in all four countries brought it to an end. At this point, the course of the four countries might as well be told as though they were provinces of the United States. Reagan's rise to power, along with his promotion of neoconservatism, which truly had its beginnings under Nixon and then flowed out to influence the Anglo countries, would ultimately lay a path for the Anglo countries to follow. In some ways, these states, Australia and Canada especially, became more successful versions of the states of Latin America, reliant on resource extraction to make ends meet. However, these countries had more robust and diversified economies, and moreover were largely using this money to fund social services, not just barely break even or squandering it in a bureaucratic money hole. And this system was relatively sensible for Australia and Canada, as these are massive countries with very small populations. If anyone can afford to capitalize on their resources, it's them. However, like the states of Latin America, the full potential of these states was never realized. Canada has nearly every geographic advantage the United States has, albeit with the handicap of a far smaller population. Development and further settlement of the interior would go a long way to not only contributing to Canada's security by giving it a population deterrence against the United States, but also allow it to more effectively harvest its natural richness, use that to fuel development of high-tech manufacturing, and carve out a place for itself as an energy trade and tech superpower. Australia likewise has a whole continent at its disposal, one which is more arid than the United States, but nevertheless one with so much going utterly underutilized. And that's just by themselves. Together, their potential could be even more significant. The search for post-imperial identity left all these countries scrambling to find themselves, and ultimately they wound up losing themselves in the new American empire. But that identity wasn't taking. There was a sense of otherness, even a sense of superiority that kept these countries from becoming replicas of America, even in spite of their lockstep Cold War politics. For the Anglos, perhaps more than anyone else, the introspection that came with trying to figure out what they were following the fall of the empire led them to take values like democracy, civil liberties, and egalitarianism to their natural conclusion. Democracy meant an opposition to authority. Civil liberties meant a right to do and be however you wish without judgment or repercussion. And egalitarianism meant equality not merely between countrymen, but for the people of the world, including access to the land, opportunities, and lifestyle of this country or that country. This even bled over into the Anglican Church, which once reigned supreme in these countries, but has now shrunk to minuscule levels in the face of secularism. But would it even matter? The Anglican Church too came to adopt these socially liberal values, in part out of belief and in another part out of an attempt to maintain relevancy as an institution. The Anglosphere has been experiencing an identity crisis for some time, and even with the exit of Britain from the European Union, all these years later, the countries of Britain, Australia, Canada, and New Zealand are adrift. Truly, Brexit was more a recognition of what Britain was not, rather than an acknowledgement of what it was. The British never internalized the cause for a united Europe, at least not for themselves. It was always a project for the continent and even a partner, but not something that was supposed to subsume them. Likewise, the Canadians refused to amalgamate with the United States, and Australia certainly does not want to become a pawn of China or Indonesia. It will take time for these countries to find themselves again, but time is running out. The world is moving by without them. They're not in a position like Africa or South America where they can afford to gradually collect themselves. All four of these countries are in very dynamic parts of the world and undergoing rapid demographic changes which could leave them with little in common with one another by the end of the century if present trends continue. There are some promising signs from each of the countries. The UK under Starmer is gravitating toward tighter immigration controls, but there is still significant hesitancy in adopting a pro-nativist stance. Canada under Mark Carney is set to pursue intense energy development, with Carney claiming that he wants Canada to become the energy superpower of the world, but this is still yet to be seen. New Zealand under Chris Luxon has moved to reduce its reliance on China in favor of the Anglosphere countries and the US, while Australia has slightly deepened its military ties with the US, UK, and New Zealand. These are bits and pieces of steps in the right direction, but it can't be too little too late. If these countries want to maintain relevancy, if they want to persist as a cultural and political bloc, they're going to need to sort themselves out and begin moving in lockstep once again. The Middle East's history during this time is one of a land and people desperately attempting, after having recently achieved real independence from Europe's pull, to carve an identity for themselves, only to be so unfortunate as to be caught between the United States and Soviet Union. The post-war period paid witness to the rise of pan-Arab nationalism in the Middle East, a sense of identity rooted in common heritage and culture which still recognized the importance of Islam to their identity, but did so with a vision of a secular modernized government. In fate's sense of poetic cruelty, so too in this time and place did the Jewish state of Israel emerge, with its own sense of Jewish nationalism or Zionism rooted in secular government. Both were militaristic, both full of national pride, and both claimed a firm right to the lands of the Levant. Warfare was inevitable. As mentioned earlier, the United States effectively succeeded Britain in their role in the region and took to making allies of various Arabian monarchies as well as the monarchy of Persia. The problem is, domestically, many of these pro-Western Middle Eastern governments were perceived as puppets by their populations, and thus coups would follow, typically installing a Ba'athist Arab nationalist or an Islamic fundamentalist in the later case of Iran. But the trend tended to be that many of these leaders opposed the West largely in the perception that the United States was simply continuing the imperialist work begun under Britain. The Soviet Union took advantage of this, as well as the more socialist-leaning and authoritarian nature of these governments, to court them over to its side. As a consequence, as well as on account of religious proclivities within the United States, there was a gravitation toward Israel as an alternative ally in the region. The Israelis had also proven themselves to be remarkably militarily capable, fending off invasion from multiple neighbors repeatedly and establishing a powerful intelligence apparatus. This alliance would not come without its hazards, however, as the American backing of Israel alienated the Islamic powers, reinforcing the perception of Western imperialism in the Middle East, and would entangle the United States in a long ethnic war between the Arabs and Israelis, contributing to future terrorist attacks upon the United States and the entry of the US into several Middle Eastern wars from which it extracted very little. West and South Central Asia would become an unexpected hotbed for nuclear proliferation as India, Israel, and Pakistan would all obtain nuclear weaponry, while fears abounded in recent times that Iran was on course to do the same. Both India and Israel achieved their stockpiles through acquiring foreign assistance, namely from France and Canada, to create nuclear reactors intended for peaceful energy production, only to covertly use their nuclear material for weapons programs. Pakistan, on the other hand, just kinda stole their intel in the same way the Soviet Union had. The Indians and Pakistanis were effectively living their own parallel version of the Arab-Israeli war since the partition of British India and the creation of the two states along Hindu and Islamic lines, complete with an Islamic socialist coming to power only to be overthrown by a US-backed Islamic fundamentalist who would proceed to back terror groups that ended up targeting the US. While India was effectively Soviet-aligned during the Cold War in response to the United States' backing of Pakistan as a counterweight to Soviet influence in Central Asia, India has gradually shifted toward a more pro-American stance as China has revealed itself to be a more pressing threat to their security. The American-Pakistani alliance gradually waned and China stepped in to fill the role America left behind. That said, the Indians refused to be treated as a junior partner, preferring to assert their autonomy and maintain alliances only to achieve certain geopolitical ends. As the struggle between the Arabs and Israelis intensified, it's important to remember the resource wealth of the Middle East, namely its oil production. This is at a time when oil is of crucial importance to fueling manufacturing, weapons of war, and transportation. So in retaliation for the United States, and by extent the West's backing of Israel, in the 1970s, several Arab states resolved to initiate an oil embargo, leading to a nearly decade-long economic crisis which wound up hurting South America probably more than anyone else in the long term. The importance of the oil trade paired with the tense atmosphere in the region forced the United States to build deeper strategic alliances with the Gulf states, especially the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, which up until recently at that time was essentially a tribal backwater, clinging to any hope of importance in the middle of the desert. But of course, that hope would be answered by the discovery of massive oil reserves in the lead up to the Second Great War, and the full exploitation of those reserves in the years following. What made Saudi Arabia unique was the United States had a pre-existing stake in the country even prior to the Cold War thanks to Chevron, then Standard Oil, who took a gamble on oil extraction there when Britain saw little opportunity. The Saudis built a lasting partnership with the United States, seeing it as a valuable ally who would bring investment into the country without resorting to the colonial tactics of Britain, and eventually this partnership and the kingdom's massive oil reserves would see to the establishing of the petrodollar following Nixon's abolition of the gold standard and the need to create a global demand for American dollars. While Israel entangled the United States in ethnic conflict, Saudi Arabia also entangled the United States in religious conflict. The US had the unfortunate circumstance of throwing its lot in with two very militant and disliked minorities in the Middle East, which in turn turned the rest of the region against the US. In the case of Saudi Arabia, this was the Hanbali Muslims, who, while Sunnis, adopted an incredibly strict scripturalist interpretation of the faith, making them remarkably more fundamentalist compared to their rationalistic religious counterparts. And while the Israelis were engaged in fending off the Arabs and expanding their land holdings in the Levant, the Saudis began engaging in a theological war, seeking to prop up fundamentalist groups and governments across the Middle East aligned with their variety of Wahhabist Islamic thought, against what they perceived as a tide of secular Arab socialism, not to mention their even more pronounced animosity toward the Shia Muslims of Persia, whom the Hanbalis didn't even recognize as fellow Muslims but as mere pagans identifying as Muslim. The United States has infamously come to be remembered by many in the region as a country which called for peace and democracy, yet backed two militant minority populations against the desires of the region's majority. And it is for this reason that despite Israel and Saudi Arabia being fundamentally at odds with one another, they more or less held their tongues to maintain their partnership with the United States for their own strategic interests. Unfortunately, this dynamic contributed to a period of constant war in the Middle East as both the Saudis and Israelis stood to benefit from the weakening of their neighbors. The Ba'athist republics, though authoritarian they may have been, intended on unifying and modernizing the Arab world, but naturally this would have posed a direct risk to Israel, who could not afford to have its enemies unified and strengthened, and to Saudi Arabia, who refused to be outcast by secular Arab nationalism from its opportunity to lead the Islamic sphere. In present day, all the Ba'athist republics have fallen, and the positions of Israel and Saudi Arabia are stronger than they have ever been, with even Iran seemingly kneecapped and brought into line. The United States, however, has grown fatigued with this region of the world, and with a sense that it can finally leave the region in a state of peace, appears eager to withdraw and leave the Middle East in the hands of its allies, while it reaps the benefits for as long as they may last. This leaves Israel in a position to seek out a new major ally, as while they are now nominally tolerated in the region, their history leaves them with few real local allies. India is increasingly being turned to as military and tech collaboration rise between the two countries, not to mention their shared opposition to Islamic fundamentalism. At the same time, India has also warmed up to the Gulf states, potentially signaling the emergence of not merely an Israeli-Indian alliance, but a new axis of pro-American allies. The last possible enduring threat to the Israelis is likely the state of Turkey, who largely sat on the sidelines of the Cold War but aligned itself with the West and NATO for its own sake, given its strategic proximity to the Soviet Union. Clearly, however, the Turks saw this as an alliance of opportunity and continued pursuing their own immediate interests, invading Cyprus and shutting down US bases, except for those deemed crucial to NATO. Resistance from Europe to fully welcome the Turks into the European sphere, a refusal to become subservient to Russia, and a lack of common ground with much of the Arab world left Turkey somewhat isolated and geopolitically homeless, but in recent years, as their military has grown, they've sought to position themselves as an alternative leader in the Islamic sphere, with a secular republican system akin to those of the Baathists, but without the feature of Arab nationalism, replacing it with a strong proclivity toward Islamic culture. Honing in on those Islamic values and framing itself as a guardian of those values has been the last thread the Turks could tug on to maintain relevancy in the region, and this has naturally led to clashing with Israel, which they view as a military threat to themselves, as well as a valuable PR opportunity by filling the void left behind by the Baathists and Iran as the leader of anti-Zionism in the region. In any case, even after all this time, it appears the Middle East's power struggle is not yet over. The African continent during the Cold War was a grand geopolitical blunder on the part of the West and the United States in particular. In an effort to signal to the world that the US opposed oppression and stood as a faction of freedom, it pressured the powers of Europe to begin a process of decolonization, believing the new independent states of Africa would see the United States as a liberator and align themselves with the West. There was a realpolitik element to this as well, in that the United States feared NATO being dragged into colonial wars, but inconsistency in policy and the sheer force of NATO together suggest that this was far less of a priority than the moral victory of ending colonialism. While well-intentioned, the results backfired dramatically. Decolonized states were evacuated hastily and power vacuums were often left. Because of the way in which Africa was partitioned by the empires of Europe, several often rivalrous populations were left to decide for themselves who was to rule, and naturally, war followed soon after. European settlers were common targets for attack following decolonization, left with insufficient support or basic protections from revanchist Africans. The Soviets saw a prime opportunity to step in and frame themselves as the region's liberators, the opposition to Western imperialism. But this had already been brewing in the continent since the Soviet Union came into existence. It had a reputation in Africa among nationalist movements, and many joined up enthusiastically. Much as in the case of Vietnam, nationalism and communism were amalgamated and became a difficult force to challenge without long-term commitment in the region. The United States and France, both recognizing the tide was not moving in the direction they desired, began propping up less than democratic governments in hopes of maintaining some Western support in Africa, namely but not exclusively in Zaire, Rwanda, Somalia, Kenya, and the Ivory Coast, and unfortunately in many instances these regimes were less nationalistic and more self-serving, enriching the ruling elite at the expense of the rest of the population. At the same time, the West was providing moderate support to pre-existing anti-communist governments in Ethiopia, Liberia, and South Africa, until Ethiopia was toppled by a Cuban-backed Marxist government and Liberia fell into chaos. Portugal as well remained an active anti-communist force in the region, refusing to decolonize and collaborating closely with South Africa and the pariah state of Rhodesia, which refused to enact majority rule against Britain's wishes, only to eventually concede and give rise to the Chinese-aligned state of Zimbabwe. This was a difficult rope for the West to walk, unable to fully back what were seen as colonialist powers like Portugal, South Africa, and Rhodesia, while simultaneously it was clear that if these regimes fell, their successors would be communist-aligned. South Africa and others across Africa, including African-led regimes, would retain support for most of the Cold War, but as the Soviets weakened, so did the West cast them aside and turn against them, decrying them as undemocratic, oppressive, and despotic. Africa should have been an easy domain for the West to hold on to, but largely on account of American idealism and ideology conflicting with the realities of geopolitics on the continent, Africa was rocked by political instability, war, dictatorship, resource crisis, and more. The US essentially pulled the trigger on the region without a long-term plan, not too dissimilar to what occurred in South America. The infrastructure, both physical and political, built by the Europeans was left in shambles, and by the end of it, most of Africa, with a handful of exceptions, was left just as dependent upon the great powers as it was during the age of colonialism, extracting resources with conditions near slave labor, and selling them cheaply to the highest bidder, only now with much more of a burden to bear on their own, more responsibilities, national and political rivalries to manage. It was a lot to hoist on the continent all at once. Independence was achieved, but at the cost of consistent government, reliable investment, and safeguards against the levels of corruption plaguing the continent today. Botswana, the island of Mauritius, Ghana, and Kenya are among the few countries to have emerged from Cold War sub-Saharan Africa with relative stability, promising economic growth, and with the exception of Kenya, low levels of corruption. South Africa, once considered a regional great power and even possessing a nuclear arsenal of its own, has fallen into decay and decline, even seeing communities resort to the adoption of private military or security forces to maintain rule of law as the country's official law enforcement has become rotten with corruption and inefficiency. Countries like China, the United States, France, Russia, and the Gulf states have varying levels of influence over the continent, the Chinese especially utilizing a resource for infrastructure exchange to extract much-needed material while simultaneously investing in these developing countries, though hand in hand with this is the problem of debt traps, and many of these countries, often either on the part of Chinese manipulation or their own mismanagement, being unable to repay their debts, see themselves become effective dependencies of the Chinese. China is not the only power African nations are indebted to, however, as the International Monetary Fund and various Western institutions also own a good chunk of Africa's debt, once again reinforcing that while these countries have achieved nominal independence, they're still highly dependent on outside powers, and the rampant corruption that sweeps the continent prevents serious efforts of reining in spending. So much that gets allocated for development winds up getting skimmed by government officials, and the debts of the countries rise while nothing gets done domestically. Pair this with land mismanagement, crumbling infrastructure, and heavy dependence upon foreign aid, and Africa has developed a major crisis of food scarcity largely through their own doing. Some African countries are moving toward becoming anchors that can ground their neighbors in an aim to create a more stable region, namely Nigeria, Botswana, and the states of Southeast Africa, who hope to pool their resources as a federation. That being said, Africa is still a long way from achieving grand geopolitical goals beyond merely reasserting control of and fully harnessing their domestic resources and establishing a stable and prosperous community. The problem may very well be that the Africans, and this stems as early as the independence of many of these countries, are attempting much too hard to emulate the Europeans and their union model. The calls for a United States of Africa or a African Union are ambitious, but ultimately pointless if these countries are struggling to get even their internal politics, economics, and standards of living in order. You can't have a transnational union of equals if you can't even manage one country. And if this is a circumstance in which one nation merely brings its less orderly neighbors into a union and projects its prosperity onto them, then that's simply an empire. And while that would be an effective model for various parts of Africa, ethnic tensions still run hot, and the memory of imperialism and colonialism leaves a sour taste in the mouths of many Africans. Meaning there's very few opportunities for a benevolent African empire to emerge and try to unite the states surrounding it. Ultimately, Africa's future is dependent upon one powerful and organized country projecting its influence onto its neighbors in an imperial fashion, or a handful of moderately successful states coming together to pool their resources. Short of that, the African continent will be condemned to be a source of resources for foreign countries more advanced and able to harness these assets. The Chinese, after a long period of chaos following the collapse of the Qing dynasty, survived a brutal war against the Japanese and were locked in the final stages of a civil war between the nationalists and communists, who briefly put aside their differences in the war against Japan. The nationalists, fragile, rife with corruption, and hemorrhaging popularity in their extreme measures and abuse of the public, including forcibly impressing citizens into the army, held a fragile upper hand over the communists, who stood cornered, albeit growing in power. The Marshall Mission to China stalled the nationalists as the US sought to strike compromise between both sides, but this only acted as an opportunity for both sides to further prepare themselves for combat. The nationalists, however, were eroding support with time, while the communists were succeeding in winning the hearts and minds of rural folk, all the while gathering and training with the weaponry the Japanese had left behind. Worse yet, the United States had halted sale of all weapons and ammunition to the nationalists during this time in the aim of promoting negotiations. This was already a dire situation for the nationalists, but the Marshall Mission likely dealt the killing blow to any hopes of success. By 1947, the communists had expanded significantly southward and the upper hand had shifted. Large numbers of nationalist troops began defecting to the communist side, including skilled officers who gave the communists exponentially growing might. In only a matter of months, the communists had seized the mainland and the nationalists fled to Taiwan. Debate over who was responsible for the loss of China led to a lengthy statement by the United States in which there was a recognition of the nationalists' corruption, undemocratic behavior, and deep unpopularity. Mao Zedong rightly questioned why the United States would support a faction so opposed to American domestic ideology and so unpopular in China, unless the United States was simply interested in prolonging the war or held imperialist ambitions to puppet the nationalist government. While the United States had hoped to achieve a coalition government, there were geopolitical ends in mind, namely having a friendly regime that could contain Soviet expansion. Ironically, Stalin too desired a coalition government, albeit one in which the communists held the upper hand, though this was also for geopolitical aims, as a less absolutist government would have allowed for greater Soviet control over Mongolia and Manchuria. Land reforms would begin almost immediately, redistributing the country's agricultural lands to the peasantry and executing some 1 million landlords with the goal of class extermination. Rapid industrialization was attempted through the Great Leap Forward, but came at the cost of tens of millions of deaths. Infrastructure would also be expanded in the interior of the country for the purpose of peopling China's frontier and further securing it from invasion, as well as giving China an interior population base should its coasts come under attack. Individuals within the Chinese Communist Party perceived as being too right-wing were identified, persecuted, and purged. Foreign influence within the country was strongly curtailed. Drug use and trafficking was firmly cracked down upon, corruption, government waste, and bloated bureaucracy were rooted out, and the four olds of culture, idea, habits, and customs were torn down. Mao came to power on a vision of what he called New Democracy, a third way between capitalism and socialism that would be a stepping stone toward true communism. To achieve this, foreign influences and imperialists would need to be driven out, the landlord class, seen as perpetuating feudalism, would need to be eradicated, a one-party state acting as a people's democratic dictatorship would be created, the government would command large-scale industries but allow for small-scale entrepreneurship, and all this would be achieved through the stratification of society along four classes: workers, peasants, small business owners, and national capitalists. While initially failing to come to fruition, it does share some similarities with the model that China would adopt later down the line. In the vein of Stalin, Mao established a cult of personality and ruled with totalitarian authority. Carrying out his Cultural Revolution was the Central Cultural Revolutionary Group, effectively dominated by a clique known as the Gang of Four, which included Mao's own wife, and which would remain a prominent force in Chinese politics until Mao's death, when they were reined in by the new chairman, Hua Guofeng. Naturally, Mao's perception that Khrushchev's liberalization and de-Stalinization was a betrayal of their communist goals would break ties with Russia in what became known as the Sino-Soviet split. In time, the Chinese came to view the Russians as social imperialists, that they were socialist in name only but in practice imperialistic, and eventually the Chinese would designate the Soviet Union as their foremost threat, contributing to the warming of Chinese-American relations under Nixon. Power would eventually shift to Deng Xiaoping just as the world was shifting to neoconservative neoliberal politics. Xiaoping would, similarly to Khrushchev, open China up and liberalize both economically and politically. However, he did so with greater tact than Khrushchev did and laid boundaries. While he criticized the excesses of the Cultural Revolution, Xiaoping enshrined that the country's commitment to socialism form of government, loyalty to the Chinese Communist Party, and most importantly reverence for Chairman Mao himself were unshakable and never to be challenged. These boundaries prevented the same disillusionment in China that was felt in the Soviet Union and allowed the government to continue reigning in dissent against the country even during the period of the New Enlightenment. Simultaneously, foreign thought and political philosophy was somewhat filtered by efforts like the Campaign Against Spiritual Pollution. Xiaoping didn't shy away from enforcing order either, recognizing a rise in criminal activity which had followed the Cultural Revolution and launching the Strike Hard campaign to crack down on violent crime across China. But perhaps most famously, Xiaoping would introduce more capitalist elements into China's economy, allowing for the creation of private enterprise, attracting foreign investment, and accelerating China's technological development, all in an aim of achieving the Confucian model of a moderately prosperous society, where the majority of the population is afforded a comfortable lifestyle, and years later in 2021, Chairman Xi Jinping would declare that the goal had been achieved. Now, reforms would be halted by the Tiananmen Square massacre, leading many in power to believe that Xiaoping's political reforms had started to go too far, and it was time to tighten up government control, but maintain the economic reforms he had introduced. Simultaneously, the Chinese began opening up to trade and business while also intensifying their surveillance state, regulating information and suppressing internal dissent. Naturally, as the Cold War ended and China and the United States remained on cordial terms, the Chinese finally ascended to membership in the World Trade Organization, Western powers believing that this would be a trigger that leads China to fully embrace capitalism, liberalism, and democracy. Instead, it drew manufacturing from all across the world into China, brought the country trillions in investment, and most alarmingly for US politicians of the time, China was replacing the US as the leading trade partner for countries across the world, especially after the 2008 financial crisis. World Trade Organization membership effectively gave China global economic reach, and it began projecting that reach across Asia and the developing world. At the same time, this money went toward turning China into a technological behemoth, Not stumbling into the same barrier the Soviets had, China pressed forward in attempting to develop the most advanced technology in the world, doing so both through its own innovation as well as through espionage and theft. Since the ascension of Chairman Xi Jinping, China's government has re-centralized power within its executive office, asserted itself in foreign affairs, especially as it pertains to the East Asian sphere, intensified China's economic nationalism, and forced conformity among party members, seeing Xi's rivals purged or sidelined to prevent threats to his authority. China's rise has been turbulent, but the results are undeniable, and the government's goal right now is to standardize and fully reap the benefits of its achievements while laying the groundwork for China to achieve superpower status both domestically and abroad. This means the enterprises established in prior decades will be nurtured but forced to conform to the state policy and maintain unwavering loyalty to the country. Developing countries around the world are receiving Chinese aid with the end goal of either seeing them as loyal allies or dependencies. As content as China has been to exist in America's world while it was focusing internally, the Chinese are now beginning to chafe under the restraints of American hegemony, a hegemony which has effectively worked to contain their expansion in the Asian Pacific. With the threat of the USSR gone, China sees only one other country that can truly challenge it, and is shaping itself up to be a capable rival. Now on to the Asian Pacific. After the war, the Asian Pacific was rattled and the site of major intervention by both the East and the West. The defeat of Japan and its post-war occupation had effectively crippled the most powerful state in the region and created a power vacuum that China would gradually fill, or so we would think. The United States, after China's turn to communism, acted quickly to secure the region and prevent the spread of Soviet influence. America's presence in the Pacific was already well established through the territories of Guam, Samoa, the minor outlying islands, not to mention the eventual state of Hawaii, and technically the Philippines, which did achieve independence after the war, but were effectively an American proxy retaining major military bases. Of course, after the war ended, this also included Okinawa and the trust territory of the Pacific Islands extracted from Japan, as well as Japan itself, as the Japanese would be under a tight military occupation by the United States, Japan having agreed to demilitarize on the condition that the United States provide for its security. This would later be known as the Yoshida Doctrine, in which Japan moved toward an economic focus, allowing the United States to largely handle defense, a policy the Europeans would unofficially and shamelessly steal for themselves later down the line. The United States was initially enthusiastic about Japan's demilitarization being enshrined in its constitution, but as it became fearful that China would rise as a militaristic communist power, and as the peaceful US-Soviet occupation in Korea began to break down, the US desperately encouraged the Japanese to rearm and reindustrialize, only for the Japanese to resist. They revived domestic industries and established a small defensive force, but still left the majority of military work to the United States, who thus maintained a presence in Japan which was the recipient of many mixed feelings. What's fascinating is that Yoshida Doctrine was never meant to be a permanent measure, only a temporary recovery phase from which Japan could emerge as an economic giant and then reassume its military might. Though even as Japan achieved this, the massive remilitarization never came. The Japanese largely retained autonomy and their pre-war institutions were largely unchanged, though the United States did help promote the rise of Japan's Liberal Democratic Party by guiding more right-wing factions into a front against left-wing elements in the country. The Liberal Democratic Party has dominated nearly without interruption since first taking power, strengthening the country's economy, guiding it through difficult periods like the global oil crisis of the 70s, deepening bonds with the United States, working toward containing China, and gradually, at the US's behest, especially since the end of the Cold War, increasing its defense spending, though still the country remains entangled in the American military web and restrained by its own constitutional clause. The Japanese are doing well overall. They do struggle with the realities of an aging population, but appear to be adapting gradually and aren't in a state of panic over the matter. Korea, partitioned between the United States and Soviet Union, was locked in a political stalemate as neither side could agree upon a joint government, leaving the North and South to be governed independently while both claiming legitimacy to the entirety of the peninsula. The North would invade the South in 1950, nearly taking the whole of South Korea before the US and United Nations intervened, and drove the North back, nearly capturing the whole of North Korea until China intervened, leaving the border almost exactly where it began. South Korea, devastated by the war, became dependent upon American aid to rebuild, as well as upon American military might for its security. The introduction of greater American influence would contribute to the rise of the country's large Protestant population, which would later contribute to a demographic tension between the country's secular, Buddhist, and Protestant religious factions. The government of Syngman Rhee, also propped up by the United States from the beginning, would be overthrown by Park Chung-hee, who the United States would come to back for his anti-communist and strongman reputation. Park Chung-hee, a former Japanese collaborator, would introduce into South Korea the same pre-war business clan model which had dominated Japan's economy since the Meiji era, and whose successor groups still remained. This would accelerate South Korea's growth by concentrating subsidies, protection, and state planning into a select few conglomerates who would be able to grow unhindered. The transition from agriculture and textiles to semiconductors was achieved within 2 decades, and South Korea, like Japan and Taiwan, would become a major engine of tech production. The country would finally transition toward a more democratic system following the end of the Cold War as the country stabilized and public discontent grew toward the authoritarian regimes of Park and his successor, though massive wealth disparities still existed within the country, leading to a great deal of political activism from the masses in an effort to shift the country in their favor and away from the remaining business clans. The sense of national pride in the country, however, has fallen. The economic circumstances leave many young Koreans disillusioned with their prospects, and religious divides leave South Koreans fragmented. Unfortunately for the Koreans, their situation is more desperate than Japan's, and while they may find themselves in as much danger as Taiwan of being invaded, at least the Taiwanese have a sense of who they are. Korea, like the Anglosphere countries, struggles with understanding itself and what it wants to be. At this point, it is more so defined, again like the Anglosphere countries, by what it is not, that being not like North Korea. Now, compared to Korea, similar initial developments transpired in Taiwan after the exile of the nationalists. Chiang Kai-shek establishing a one-party military-backed regime and de facto falling under American protection to protect the fledgling republic from conquest by China. Decades of repression would follow as an effort to eradicate communist elements within the country and prevent security risks from emerging took place. The United States would funnel billions in aid to allow Taiwan or the Republic of China to develop the island and establish significant defense systems. Unlike South Korea and Japan, Taiwan saw its economy take off from massive state-owned enterprises in the vein of South America, but also encouraged small and medium-sized private enterprises to balance things out. This model created a more equal society than South Korea's, as wealth was more evenly split among the classes than concentrated in an upper elite. Even once the United States switched its recognition to the People's Republic of China, the US continued and continues to maintain relations with Taiwan not as the government of China, but as a sovereign entity distinct from the People's Republic of China, making assurances that it will not seek a reunification of the two, despite its recognition of the PRC. This has effectively turned Taiwan into a protectorate of the US, a territory which China claims right to, but which the US refuses to abandon. The country has democratized since the height of the Cold War and now seeks to abandon the nationalist claim to the whole of China in favor of forging a new path and identity as a Taiwanese state alone. This comes especially as the Chinese Communist Party has made inroads negotiating with the formerly dominant Nationalist Party, seeing some Chinese nationalists within Taiwan come to adopt a support for Chinese unity under the PRC. That said, Taiwan doesn't suffer from the same issues Korea does, at least not on the same scale. There is debate over the Taiwanese identity, but this has less to do with demographic divides and more with reconciling historic ambitions with geopolitical realities. Should Taiwan continue as part of China, or just continue as something new? In Vietnam, of course, the United States picked up where France left off and attempted to prop up an authoritarian government representative of foreign influence and culture. This is why it was so incredibly difficult for the US and France to maintain control of the country. Because they weren't just fighting a faction that was committed to communism, they were fighting the Vietnamese who were committed to a free Vietnam. Ho Chi Minh, though he was a communist, was also a nationalist. His foremost goal was independence for Vietnam, and that was a goal which was always going to resonate more strongly with the Vietnamese people than any foreign power propping up a government which did not represent them. Similar might be said in Cambodia and Laos, though that was more a circumstance of Vietnam propping up communist regimes in those countries, while the US failed to build the popularity of the domestic anti-communist regimes. Pol Pot's communist regime actually had to be overthrown by Vietnam, who proceeded to install someone less radical. The three continue to be partners today, with Vietnam especially attempting to work with China, but simultaneously maintain its autonomy and work with the United States as well toward containing China from growing too powerful. Laos and Cambodia, on the other hand, find themselves far more dependent upon Chinese investment and partnership. Eastasia is probably the US's greatest Cold War success story, rebuilding states like Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan, guiding them through the turbulent waves of Cold War politics, and reintroducing them to the post-Soviet world as wealthy democratic powers. Vietnam, Laos, and North Korea remain communist and are a mixed bag, with Vietnam largely being welcomed on the global scene and North Korea effectively being outcast. The region's future is largely dependent upon whether it will be shaped by the United States or China. The US has an edge in that it effectively has 3 success stories under its belt. The East Asian countries remain skeptical of Chinese ambitions, not wishing to see China grow too powerful, earning the US allies in Indonesia, Vietnam, and the Philippines. In the long term, an alternative is going to need to be established, as it's possible and likely America will grow fatigued with East Asia if it spirals into another sphere of perpetual intervention. In such case, a final push to remilitarize Japan and forge a union or alliance between it, Taiwan, and South Korea could create a domestic power fully capable of rivaling China independently. The downside would be that former allies like the Philippines, Vietnam, and Indonesia may now grow as skeptical of this alliance or union as they are of China. Though that could be offset by the fact that while such a union would be formidable, it wouldn't be able to topple China, simply keep them in check. Such a proposal is purely hypothetical, but as the US withdraws from Europe and the Middle East to pivot to the Pacific, policy here is likely to accelerate and evolve to meet needs. China in turn will work to fortify itself internally and compromise American chances of containing it, most likely through a final acquisition of Taiwan and a breaking of the first island chain. The Americans want security, the Chinese want their place in the sun, to be left alone to dominate East Asia and retain a spot as a major global power, namely the Empire of the East. In some ways, this is reminiscent to Germany in World War I wanting to carve out its own imperial realm, acting as continental leader of Europe, and being able to economically compete with and ultimately surpass Britain's multi-continental empire. China has been around for a long time, and it's willing to play a long game to gradually eke out a firmer grasp on East Asia if and when the US slips up. I'd like to thank you guys once again for tuning into this video. We're doing a quick little face cam thing right now. This video became a lot bigger than I thought it was going to be. I kind of got carried away with my script writing, but, I'm happy with how it came out. In the future, if my scripts end up running this long, I might just break them up into multi-part videos. I honestly could have turned this into one video on the Americas, one on Europe, one on the rest of the world. But hey, it is what it is. And so we conclude how the Cold War continues to shape everything in the modern day, and where its aftershocks are leading countries. That's not to say some countries can't escape these paths, but without some kind of massive shakeup or reorientation, this is where these countries have been, where they are, and likely where they are going. Thank you all for watching. This took quite a bit of time to put together, so if you are indeed still watching, I hope you'll give us a like and subscribe for more. Mr. Z, out.